and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott, and tonight we'll be talking about a difficult topic, one that I think no one would like to talk about, but that we see in the news a lot, and that requires some serious discussion on the part of all of us. And that would be gun violence, and whether we can ever get in control of it. Our guest tonight is author Lee Goodman, the author of the new book, Too Many Guns, Too Many Rights.
Too many rights and too many guns.
Too many rights and too many guns, yes. So Lee, welcome back to the show. It's a pleasure to have you back.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So you have just published this book. It's just come out. I have to say you make a very compelling case for what you're talking about, but our audience doesn't know what that is, so I will summarize briefly that you are recommending that we repeal the Second Amendment of the Constitution of the United States, which actually has been interpreted by the Supreme Court, as you know, to say that individuals have the constitutional right to bear arms. Most people must look at you and say, you're crazy.
The first reaction I get from a lot of people is, come on, Lee, let's be serious. You're not going to be able to amend the Constitution. Because we've gotten used to choosing very, very modest goals and trying to win them. So my first reaction is, why not? We've amended it 27 times before.
Because there are 27 amendments to the Constitution.
27. The very first Congress put 10 of them in. We call that the Bill of Rights. But every generation has amended the Constitution since then. And in my lifetime, we've amended it 6 times, I think. So it's not that unusual a thing. What would be unusual is if we stopped amending the Constitution. So the real question is, since the Constitution was formed by the Founding Fathers so that it could be amended, and there's a process laid out, why shouldn't we do it? Why shouldn't we have a Constitution that reflects our times, our values, our needs? And I can't think of a good reason why we shouldn't have control of our Constitution, because this is a democracy, and that means everything from the Constitution all the way down.
Now, I want to clarify, too, because in reading the book, I understand what your position is on the Second Amendment, but I think it's easy for people to say, well, if we repeal the Second Amendment, we're going to take away everybody's guns, and there will be no gun ownership everywhere. And that's not the message that you're making, or at least it's not the message I took from the book. Rather, it seems that you're saying that, and I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but that without the constitutional clause, without the Second Amendment, that states would be free to make their own laws, states and municipalities. Some states, gun ownership might be fine. Some areas, like the city of Chicago, which tried to ban handgun ownership, that would be doable, and it wouldn't violate what's now seen as a constitutional right. Is that sum it up properly?
You got it exactly correct. What has stood in the way of legislation that pretty much everyone in the country wants, certain gun control legislation, what stands in the way is the notion that everyone has a right to have a gun, which is sort of what the Supreme Court said in 2008, that everyone does have a right to have a gun in their home for their own personal protection. So once you've got that fundamental constitutional right, it's really hard, both politically and in question of court scrutiny, whether it will be allowed to have these laws. So the idea is, since most people in this country don't want guns themselves, and they don't want so much gun violence, they would like to see laws enacted. In order to get those laws enacted, what we have to do first is remove the constitutional impediment that stands in the way of getting the laws. So if we did amend the Constitution, repeal the Second Amendment, get rid of the right to have guns, the next day, none of the legislation that's in effect would change. So it would then be a question of, what do municipalities and states and the federal government want to change? If a city, as you said, wants to totally ban a certain type of gun, they could do that constitutionally.
Which today they really can't do because of this constitutional
Well,
law.
it's a question of how far they can go. Certainly the court has said some gun control will be upheld, and some has been upheld by the federal courts and state courts. But it would make it much easier for people to get the laws that the people want.
Now, you spent a lot of time in the introduction, in the early parts of the book, talking about the societal costs of gun violence. And I'm not sure if people really recognize just how big a threat it is. What, 30,000 gun deaths a year? Is that the right figure?
Roughly 30,000, and that's been the level for many, many years. And the significance of that can, I think, be appreciated if you take a look at automobile accident deaths, for instance, in this country. They are right now just at about the same level, at about 30,000. But a few decades ago, they were up over 50,000. We have steadily brought down the number of automobile accidents through a number of pieces of legislation, enforcement, court action, regulation, and at the same time we've done nothing to reduce the number of gun deaths. So we're getting safer in terms of automobiles, and we're staying just as dangerous a place in terms of guns.
Now, one other thing, you actually brought up many interesting points in the book, but one that struck me was this idea that municipalities and localities could regulate guns. And one of the examples you brought up is the old city of Tombstone, Arizona, where guns were prohibited inside the city limits. And this was just accepted in the wild, wild west, where everybody had a gun, at least in the images, popular images we have. Everybody had a gun, everybody was packing on their hip, and yet this city was able to ban them, and that was seen as being perfectly reasonable. So why is it not reasonable today?
Because we got a conservative, activist Supreme Court that in 2008 totally revamped the understanding of the Second Amendment. Up until that point, basically a couple of hundred years, our whole history, everyone understood that the Second Amendment meant what it said. That is, for the purposes of a well-regulated militia, you could have guns. That is to say, the militia, the state police, so to speak, could have guns. No one ever thought that it meant every individual had a personal right to have a gun until 2008. The Supreme Court erased, literally just said that part of the amendment, Second Amendment, means nothing. They took it out, and now all of a sudden we've got a wholly different Second Amendment. That's why up until 2008, cities banned guns. They banned certain types of guns. They had very strict restrictions on who could get them. They didn't allow concealed carry, certainly didn't allow open carry, on and on and on. The things that we're seeing coming about now, prior to 2008, it was widely understood and barely questioned that the municipalities had a right to do this.
So what do you think, I'll use the word triggered, the Supreme Court to make this sweeping revision?
It's difficult to say because if you read the court's opinion, it's sort of a mess and it talks about history that never really existed. Basically, you had an activist conservative Supreme Court that was influenced by whatever lobbies and philosophies and the rest of it. It's a very, very strange decision. It was a mistake.
Now, in the book, you talk about various ways that could be reversed, one of which would be to wait for a different court and bring a different case. But your suggestion is that might take years or decades for that to happen. The alternative of eliminating the Second Amendment, repealing the Second Amendment, wouldn't that also take decades, perhaps, to
It's difficult to tell. Typically, amendments take a long time. The amendment that got women the right to vote took kind of forever up until that point. It's generally said that it took about 60 years from the time it started to be discussed until the time it went through. The amendment that gave African Americans the right to vote took many decades, basically the whole history of our country up until that time. So it could take a long time. On the other hand, we're seeing lots of changes in this country right now, whether it's fed by the internet or social media or communication or whatever it is. We're seeing changes in this country come about in a lot of different areas that no one thought would happen as quickly as they're happening. So it's really not that predictable how long it'll take.
Well, in fact, as a good example, gay marriage, which a few decades ago was considered a pipe dream. That'll never happen. You just can't even, why even work towards it? In fact, I know friends of mine who were gay that a couple of, but maybe 10 years ago, were kind of angry with people for trying to push this gay marriage thing because they thought, let's work on things that are achievable. Let's not waste our time on this pie in the sky kind of idea. And now here 10 years later, it's fact. And this same activist Supreme Court is the one that made it possible, which is an interesting irony.
It's hard to explain. And I don't, by any means, mean to denigrate people who work for other types of goals as far as guns, gun safety. And I support many of those efforts. But I think before we're going to see success in most of those efforts, as constrained as they are, we're going to have to actually face the real fundamental question, which is raised in my book and is raised by the question of raising the Second Amendment, is do we really want this many guns? Do we want this many deaths, this many shootings? Very few people in this country have any interest in guns anymore. We're down to about 22% of the population that has guns. It's a historically low segment of the population. So if we don't want the guns and if we don't want the deaths and we don't want the terror that people live in, and we don't want to have to pay for all the police that we're paying for to guard against it, we don't want to have to pay for the prisons, all of the things that flow from this violence, then why not face the fundamental question of, do we really think people should have a right to have a gun? It doesn't exist virtually anywhere else in the world.
Now, coming back to gun violence, you just talked about only about 22% of the population actually owns guns. The book does an interesting job of explaining who it is who owns these guns, and your belief expressed in the book is that it's mostly angry white men who own these, and that in other demographic communities, in the Latino community, it's not as prevalent, and even in the African American community, it's not as prevalent, even though if you watch the news, you would think that the only place where gun violence takes place is in the African American community. But in fact, it's the gun advocates that you talk about in the book are largely white male, right?
Gun ownership skews geographically. Certain parts of the country have more guns than others. Certain parts of states where you've got hunting perhaps might make a difference, where you've got larger concentrations of military families. You've got a lot of factors, but racial factors certainly play into it. And when I say that in the book that it's angry white men, it's not necessarily that they're the only gun owners, but they are the vocal proponents who are saying people should be able to walk into the grocery store with a semi-automatic rifle on their back. They are the ones who are leading the charge, largely driven by their sense of frustration and anger with their position in the world. This is something that the Constitution has said to them they can have. It's a right that they have, and they're asserting it as if it had some value to society.
Now, I know you've made that statement in the book. How do you know that that's the motivation of the people who are so forcefully in favor of gun rights? I mean, are you reading that into it, or is there some studies, some statistics that have studied the psychology of gun owners?
There are a number of studies that look to the psychology. There are studies that look to the demographics in terms of large numbers. I don't mean to say that all people who have guns are angry white men. But if you're going to look at large numbers, you have to face the facts. And the facts are that gun ownership is concentrated in certain segments of our society.
So if we were looking at getting rid of guns, now some of the arguments that come up, and you handle these in your book, are, and I've heard this argument myself from some of our elected officials. Well, in Illinois, for example, if you go downstate, a lot of these guys are hunters, and and they have a completely different idea about gun ownership, and this particular state official was talking about, well, you have to respect the fact that these hunters have guns and they want to go out and hunt. You make an interesting argument in the book about whether hunting is a social good.
We have tended to, those of us, many of us, who want to see a reduction in the deaths and the mayhem and the gun violence, have tended over the last many years to grant that, okay, people can go and hunt. Those people are okay. But if you take a look at it from the environmental consequences of killing hundreds of thousands of deers in any one state like Wisconsin every year, of the damage that it does to the ecosystem, and we've pretty much eliminated beavers in this country and buffalo a long time ago. We know about those things. There's similar problems being created by hunters all the time. And then there's the problem of hunters shooting each other and shooting innocent people who want to enjoy the woods and making these areas off grounds. Then there's the lead pollution that goes into the land. And then there's the whole idea of what is the morality of going out and slaughtering animals who were there enjoying their lives just so that you can enjoy the feeling of killing something. I think we should examine that.
Now, I think that's a really compelling thought, and it struck me when I read that in the book about the concept of hunting, because like many people, I just accepted it. Well, some people hunt, and that's what they do, and I really didn't think twice about it. But if I think about if someone shot my dog, for example, I'd be really upset about it. And, I know my dog, and I know my dog has a personality, and, my dog enjoys certain things. And as we as a species understand more and more about the animals around us, and understanding how much conscious thought they have, how much sentience they have, we've come to realize, many people are starting to reevaluate the relationships that we have with the other animals. And this, I think, speaks to that. Like, who are we? Now, you mentioned about predators. A lion will kill its prey, but it doesn't kill wantonly. It kills when it needs to eat, and then it leaves everybody else alone. We seem to be the only ones who kill for sport.
I'm always cautious about saying that we are the only animals who do anything, because biologists who study these things
Are
find
constantly
all sorts of
finding new
things that
things,
go
right.
on. But what we do know is that there's very few people in this country who go out hunting who actually need that food, and there's virtually none of them for whom there wouldn't be some other substitute. And it's not just a question of looking at the needs or the wants of the people who are hunting. I think we should be concerned about the animals. There's
Yeah.
a religious component to this, which is very interesting, because there are those who say that we are told we are to have dominion over the other animals, as if that means we can go and wantonly kill them. There are those who interpret those same exact words to say we are to have stewardship over the rest of the world, and we are to help preserve and protect it. And this enters in also very much to how people view the world.
So if we take the arguments for gun ownership, one is hunting. Another one you address is the idea of safety. But early on in the book, you bring up a very interesting study done about the attack on the Charlie Hebdo offices in Paris, where terrorists attacked and killed 13 or 14 people. And it described that because it was a pro-gun group that did a reenactment.
Well, I'm hesitant to talk about a particular instance, and I'll tell you why. Because what we tend to do is to look at every particular instance. Fairly recently, there was someone who went in and shot up people who were at prayer in a church. We all know about the shootings of the little children in the school. We know about the shootings at the college campuses. We know about, years ago, the fellow who got up in the University of Texas tower and shot at the other students. There are all these instances, and when we look at any particular instance, we can find explanations, mental health, whatever it happens to be. We need to examine those things, but before we go into any particular instance, what I want to caution is any particular instance is not the whole story.
Well, but the reason it struck me is because the point you were making is a refutation of the argument that if all the good guys had guns, the bad guys wouldn't be able to kill anyone. And the example you raised with the Charlie Hebdo one was that a pro-gun group, I forget which one, reenacted it with paintball guns to show that their intent was to show that had the Charlie Hebdo staffers been armed, they could have prevented the attack. But no matter how many times they ran the simulation, they all died.
And there have been any number of similar studies where people have simulated armed citizens, good guys supposedly, with concealed weapons or open weapons, and what could they have done to stop a crime. And every one of these studies shows the element of surprise. It wins out. You don't have time to react, and if you do react, the accuracy of your shot, your judgment as far as who you might be shooting at, all these things, that's why police and Army, people who are involved in this, they train on a regular basis. They don't just go into the range once a year and qualify. People who are actually expecting to be involved in these situations are training and training and training, and they still get it wrong.
Well, in fact, I read somewhere that the police, even when the police are shooting at suspects, they miss far more often than they actually strike the target. And they're, as you say, highly trained.
And the truth is, our military has the exact same experience. It's not like it is on TV. It's not a one shot as you're leaping through the air and you miss the hostage and you get the bad guy. It's a hazardous endeavor. And the thought that any fellow who goes out and plunks down the money should be out there protecting us. I think if you talk to most police officers, they're going to tell you they think we'd all be a lot safer if there are a lot fewer guns out there.
Well, going back to the example of Tombstone, Arizona, that was the reason that the guns were prohibited from coming within the city limits because, right, that just everybody was armed and too many people were getting killed.
Well, the story as I read the history, it's hard to know for sure, but the story is that the cowboys would come into town on a Friday night with their pay, and they'd get a little liquored up, and who knows what's going to happen. And the truth was there was no positive benefit to having all those people armed. And it was pretty obvious everyone was safer without all the guns.
And so you take that to today, even in the tougher neighborhoods, like there was a great story on National Public Radio about Englewood here in Chicago and the kids who have such ready access to guns. And the thing that struck me in that story was they were talking to a couple of kids who, when they left school, they would always walk down the middle of the street. which alienated the drivers. They said, well, why are these kids? And the reaction was, well, these kids are just being jerks, you know. And in fact, when the reporter interviewed the kids, one kid, about why they walked down the middle of the street, they said, because it gives you the most room to maneuver. If someone starts to shoot at you, you have the most room to get out of the way. And I thought, this is like a 14-year-old saying, oh, well, yeah, you know, if someone starts to shoot at you, you got to give yourself enough room. I mean, it's devastating to hear a 14-year-old say that so matter-of-factly, that they have to consider that. But here it is, if the guns weren't there, then that situation would dramatically change.
There are neighborhoods, not just in Chicago, but all around the country, where that kind of reality exists. Unfortunately, that type of shooting, the drive-by shooting, the gang-related, territorial motivated, whatever it happens to be, tends to be concentrated in areas where people are not at the advantage of other people. Mm-hmm. But that's not the whole gun problem. We get a very skewed view from reading the news and listening to the news about what the gun problem is in this country. Most of the gun fatalities in this country are suicides. And those are not by any means concentrated in any particular neighborhood. Those are wherever there are gun suicides, because it's an easy and very lethal way. It's a pretty certain way if a person wants to kill themselves. Most likely, if they use a gun, they're going to succeed and kill themselves. Comparatively, most likely if you use any other method of attempted suicide, you're going to fail. So
you never hear that in the news, that gun violence would be, eliminating guns would be a way to prevent suicides. And that's a public mental health issue, right? But that's never discussed. So what is it in the media that's going on or not going on that can be changed or that we might want to address?
I think part of the problem is that mental health professionals are quite aware of this. If you talk in their circles, there's no doubt about this. I think we feel uncomfortable with suicide, generally. We tend to feel uncomfortable with mental health problems, generally. And there's nothing particularly exciting about reporting about a suicide. It's a pretty depressing fact. On the other hand, if you can put a story together about a shootout in a shopping mall and who made it and who didn't, then you sound like you're starting to talk about a drama.
Then it's exciting. Yes.
It can be.
Now let's come back to the constitutional amendment as well. How does that get started? How does that movement begin to grow? Now you mentioned some influential people who also support this idea, but how do you get that into the public consciousness?
Well, probably a good number of your viewers will decide that this is what they want to do. And what they'll do is they'll take up the same kind of action that they've done with any of a number of other causes. They'll start writing letters to the editor, they'll talk amongst their friends, they'll invite speakers into their churches and their other groups, they'll talk to their legislators, and basically it's going to take all those sorts of actions and more. My writing the book is just one tiny piece of putting together some of the arguments and the consideration for people. How is it going to happen? It's going to happen, hopefully, through a grassroots democratic process like everything else happens in this country.
And the first step they should do, of course, is to read your book, right?
Well, they could do that. It
yes,
could help.
Actually, hold up the book and we'll see if we can get, if that's close enough. Yeah, turn it a little bit. There you go. Too many rights and too many guns. So I do recommend people read the book. But coming back to the constitutional issue, there's several steps, right? I mean, it has to go through Congress first. So the Congress people have to create this idea. It has to pass both houses of Congress, and then it has to be ratified by 2/3 of the states. Right. So is there anything that you can do at a lower level? Can the states themselves initiate something?
Theoretically, they can, but it's never really happened that way. The Constitution provides an alternative of it going that way. But history tells us if it's going to happen through Congress. But then what is Congress? Congress is a politician who represents a district, who hopefully is somewhat in touch with what the district wants, who comes back to the district looking for votes and hopefully for ideas and input. So it's really a fairly fundamental question of, just as people talk to their school board members or their park district members, they can talk to their Congress people. And what will happen is, as it becomes popular, then Congress people will start introducing the legislation.
Well, in fact, there's an old saying that I heard back from the days when we were protesting the invasion of Iraq, and that is that politicians generally don't start movements, they just get in front of movements that have already started moving.
And that's okay.
It is okay. I got
no problem with the people being the ones who are moving this country forward.
Well, that's generally how it works anyway. I mean, in fact, even going back to the example of gay marriage, really it was the groundswell of popular opinion that had changed so dramatically over just a couple of decades that I think fostered this, what to me was a very surprising ruling by the Supreme Court.
We can take a look at another very recent example, which had to do, it arose out of a shooting, but there was an association between the shooter and the Confederate flag. So all of a sudden, after all these years, people started to think, do we really need Confederate flags displayed on state capitol grounds and other places, and changes being made there. So change can happen unexpectedly and very suddenly.
As we've seen repeatedly. So in Illinois, do you know which, the Illinois delegation to the House and our Illinois senators, do you know where any of them would stand on this issue of the Second Amendment?
I have not discussed it directly with any of them. I don't intend to discuss it with them until they either bring it up or until I feel that they will be receptive. And my expectation is at this point there'll probably be very, very little receptivity because by and large politicians don't go looking for issues ahead of the people. They wait for the people to raise the issue. On the other hand, to answer your question, there have been a number of people in the Illinois delegation who've been pretty good on gun control issues over the years. I would expect those same people would be the ones who would carry this forward.
So if you were reaching out to people today, and you do this as part of your, actually I have to, while I have you, I have to ask you, what got you so motivated to this, particularly to sit down and write a book? How did this touch you?
I've worked on the issue for a number of years, just as a person who's involved in issues. In the course of doing that, I've met a number of people who have lost family members to guns, and particularly a number of parents who lost children to guns. Just yesterday, I was at another memorial for a very small child who was shot. And at some point, if that doesn't start to affect you, then you ought to really start and look at what is it, how are you relating to the world? It started to affect me. I started to realize that just too many people are suffering for no reason. These are not, again, how is it reported? It's reported as if so many of the victims were involved in gangs or somehow did something to bring this about. Well, that's just not the case in many, many of these instances. Particularly, it's obvious when children are involved. They did nothing, and they're getting gunned down. And it's not just the child, it's the parents, it's the grandparents, it's the other children who are affected. The way that this terrorism, and there's a word I don't like to use too much, but it is the terror of people being shot in their everyday lives is astounding. So that's how it affected me as I started to realize the consequences. This is not an issue that I want to see just go on without being addressed.
Well, you just used the word terrorism. Would you rank this as terrorism, and would it be useful for society to look at gun violence as terrorism and all that implies in our current society?
It's difficult because people look at, that's why I say I don't usually look, I'm surprised I used the word here, but what we should look at is what does it do to the psyche, like you said, of the 14-year-old walking down in the middle of the street, who probably learned that lesson a good deal younger and passed it on to that person's younger siblings. What does it do to parents who know that if they let their children out, even to go to school or to go to the park, there's some danger there? What does it do to people who think there's a gun in the house and I know that my husband has some difficulties? Do I want to worry every day he's going to go out and shoot himself?
On that note, as disturbing as it is, we're out of time. Lee, I hope that, in fact, I would encourage everyone to read your book, Too Many Rights and Too Many Guns. I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank you for all you do for this cause.
Thank you.
And we'll have you back again.
Thanks very much.
And thank you for visiting with us one more time. This is Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. You can find us every Saturday night on Comcast Channel 19 at 8 o'clock, and you can see us on the web at publicperspective.tv. So until next time, thank you and good night.